Section 13 of Redburn, His First Voyage. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Redburn, His First Voyage, by Herman Melville. Chapters 56 through 59. Chapter 56. Under the lee of the longboat, Redburn and Harry hold confidential communion. A sweet thing is a song, and though the Hebrew captives hung their harps on the willows, that they could not sing the melodies of Palestine before the haughty beards of the Babylonians, yet to themselves those melodies of other times and a distant land were as sweet as the June dew on Herman. And poor Harry was as the Hebrews. He, too, had been carried away captive, though his chief captor and foe was himself. And he, too, many a night, was called upon to sing for those who through the day had insulted and derided him. His voice was just the voice to proceed from a small, silken person like his. It was gentle and liquid, and meandered and tinkled through the words of a song, like a musical brook that winds and wantons by pied and pansied margins. "I can't sing to-night," sadly said Harry to the Dutchman, who with his watchmates requested him to while away the middle watch with his melody. "I can't sing to-night." "But Wellingborough," he whispered, and I stooped my ear. "Come you with me under the lee of the longboat, and there I'll hum you an air." It was "The Banks of the Blue Moselle." Poor, poor Harry, and 1,000 times friendless and forlorn. To be singing that thing which was only meant to be warbled by falling fountains in gardens, or in elegant alcoves in drawing-rooms, to be singing it here, as I live under the tarry lee of our longboat. But he sang and sang, as I watched the waves, and peopled them all with sprites, and cried chassez, hands across, to the multitudinous quadrilles, all danced on the moonlit musical floor. But though it went so hard with my friend to sing his songs to this ruffian crew, whom he hated, even in his dreams, till the foam flew from his mouth while he slept, yet at last I prevailed upon him to master his feelings, and make them subservient to his interests. For so delighted, even with the rudest minstrelsy, are sailors, that I well knew Harry possessed a spell over them, which, for the time at least, they could not resist, and it might induce them to treat with more deference the being who was capable of yielding them such delight. Carlo's organ they did not much care for, but the voice of my Bury blade was an accordion in their ears. So, one night, on the windlass, he sat and sang, and from the ribald jests so common to sailors, the men slid into silence at every verse. Hushed and more hushed they grew, till at last Harry sat among them like Orpheus among the charmed leopards and tigers. Harmless now the fangs with which they were wont to tear my zebra, and backward curled in velvet paws, and fixed their once glaring eyes in fascinated and fascinating brilliancy. Aye, still and hissingly all, for a time they relinquished their prey. Now, during the voyage, the treatment of the crew threw Harry more and more upon himself for companionship, and few can keep constant company with another without revealing some, at least, of their secrets, for all of us yearn for sympathy, even if we do not for love, and to be intellectually alone is a thing only tolerable to genius, whose cherisher and inspirer is solitude. But though my friend became more communicative concerning his past career than ever he had been before, yet he did not make plain many things in his hitherto but partly divulged history, which I was very curious to know. and especially he never made the remotest allusion to aught connected with our trip to London, while the oath of secrecy by which he had bound me held my curiosity on that point a captive. However, as it was, Harry made many very interesting disclosures, and if he did not gratify me more in that respect, he atoned for it in a measure by dwelling upon the future and the prospects, such as they were, which the future held out to him. He confessed that he had no money but a few shillings left from the expenses of our return from London, that only by selling some more of his clothing could he pay for his first week's board in New York, and that he was altogether without any regular profession or business upon which, by his own exertions, he could securely rely for support. And yet he told me that he was determined never again to return to England, and that somewhere in America he must work out his temporal felicity. "I have forgotten England," he said, "and never more mean to think of it. So tell me, Wellingborough, what am I to do in America?" It was a puzzling question, and full of grief to me, who, young though I was, had been well rubbed, curried, and ground down to fine powder in the hopper of an evil fortune, and who, therefore, could sympathize with one in similar circumstances. For though we may look grave, and behave kindly and considerately to a friend in calamity, yet if we have never actually experienced something like the woe that weighs him down, we cannot with the best grace proffer our sympathy. And perhaps there is no true sympathy but between equals, and it may be that we should distrust that man's sincerity who stoops to condole with us. So Harry and I, two friendless wanderers, beguiled many a long watch by talking over our common affairs. But inefficient as a benefactor as I certainly was, still, being an American and returning to my home, even as he was a stranger and hurrying from his, therefore I stood toward him in the attitude of the prospective doer of the honors of my country. I accounted him the nation's guest. Hence, I esteemed it more befitting that I should rather talk with him than he with me, that his prospects and plans should engage our attention in preference to my own. Now, seeing that Harry was so brave a songster and could sing such bewitching airs, I suggested whether his musical talents could not be turned to account. The thought struck him most favorably. "Gad, my boy, you have hit it, you have." And then he went on to mention that in some places in England it was customary for 2 or 3 young men of highly respectable families, of undoubted antiquity, but unfortunately in lamentably decayed circumstances and threadbare coats, it was customary for 2 or 3 young gentlemen so situated to obtain their livelihood by their voices, coining their silvery songs into silvery shillings. They wandered from door to door, and rang the bell. "Are the ladies and gentlemen in?" Seeing them at least gentlemanly looking, if not sumptuously apparelled, the servant generally admitted them at once. And when the people entered to greet them, their spokesman would rise with a gentle bow and a smile, and say, "We come, ladies and gentlemen, to sing you a song. We are singers at your service." And so, without waiting reply, forth they burst into song, and having most mellifluous voices, enchanted and transported all auditors; so much so, that, at the conclusion of the entertainment, they very seldom failed to be well recompensed, and departed with an invitation to return again, and make the occupants of that dwelling once more delighted and happy. "Could not something of this kind now be done in New York?" said Harry. "Or are there no parlors with ladies in them there?" he anxiously added. Again I assured him, as I had often done before, that New York was a civilized and enlightened town, with a large population, fine streets, fine houses, nay, plenty of omnibuses; and that for the most part he would almost think himself in England, so similar to England in essentials was this outlandish America that haunted him. I could not but be struck, and had I not been from my birth, as it were, a cosmopolite, I had been amazed at his skepticism with regard to the civilization of my native land. A greater patriot than myself might have resented his insinuations. He seemed to think that we Yankees lived in wigwams and wore bearskins. After all, Harry was a piece of a Cockney, and had shut up his Christendom in London. Having then assured him that I could see no reason why he should not play the troubadour in New York, as well as elsewhere, he suddenly popped upon me the question whether I would not join him in the enterprise, as it would be quite out of the question to go alone on such a business. Said I, "My dear Bury, I have no more voice for a ditty than a dumb man has for an oration. Sing? Such macadamized lungs have I, that I think myself well off that I can talk, let alone nightingaling." So that plan was quashed, and by Harry began to give up the idea of singing himself into a livelihood. "No, I won't sing for my mutton," said he. "What would Lady Georgiana say?" "If I could see her ladyship once, I might tell you, Harry," returned I, who did not exactly doubt him, but felt ill at ease for my bosom friend's conscience when he alluded to his various noble and right honorable friends and relations. "But surely, Bury, my friend, you must write a clerkly hand among your other accomplishments, and that, at least, will be sure to help you." "I do write a hand," he gladly rejoined. "There, look at the implement. Do you not think that such a hand as that might dot an I or cross a T with a touching grace and tenderness?" Indeed, but it did betoken a most excellent penmanship. It was small, and the fingers were long and thin, the knuckles softly rounded, the nails hemispherical at the base, and the smooth palm furnishing few characters for an Egyptian fortune-teller to read. It was not as the sturdy farmer's hand of Cincinnatus, who followed the plough and guided the state, but it was as the perfumed hand of Petronius Arbiter, that elegant young buck of a Roman who once cut great Seneca dead in the Forum. His hand alone would have entitled my Bury blade to the suffrages of that Eastern potentate, who complimented Lord Byron upon his feline fingers, declaring that they furnished indubitable evidence of his noble birth. And so it did, for Lord Byron was, as all the rest of us, the son of a man, and so are the dainty-handed and wee-footed half-caste paupers in Lima, who, if their hands and feet were entitled to consideration, would constitute the oligarchy of all Peru. Folly and foolishness! To think that a gentleman is known by his fingernails, like Nebuchadnezzar when his grew long in the pasture, or that the badge of nobility is to be found in the smallness of the foot, when even a fish has no foot at all. Dandies, amputate yourselves if you will, but know and be assured, O Democrats, that, like a pyramid, a great man stands on a broad base. It is only the brittle porcelain pagoda that toddles on a toe. But though Harry's hand was ladylike looking, and had once been white as the Queen's cambric handkerchief, and free from a stain as the reputation of Diana, yet his late pulling and hauling of halyards and clewlines, and his occasional dabbling in tar-pots and slush-shoes, had somewhat subtracted from its original daintiness. Often he ruefully eyed it. "Oh, hand," thought Harry, "ah, hand, what have you come to? Is it seemly that you should be polluted with pitch, when you once handed countesses to their coaches? Is this the hand I kissed to the divine Georgiana, with which I pledged Lady Blessington, and ratified my bond to Lord Lovely? This, the hand that Georgiana clasped to her bosom, when she vowed she was mine, out of sight, recreant and apostate? Deep down, disappear in this foul monkey-jacket pocket, where I thrust you." After many long conversations, it was at last pretty well decided that upon our arrival at New York, some means should be taken among my few friends there to get Harry a place in a mercantile house, where he might flourish his pen and gently exercise his delicate digits by traversing some soft foolscap, in the same way that slim, pallid ladies are gently drawn through a park for an airing. Chapter 57. Almost a Famine. "Mammy, mammy, come and see the sailors eating out of little troughs, just like our pigs at home." Thus exclaimed one of the steerage children, who at dinner-time was peeping down into the forecastle, where the crew was assembled, helping themselves from the kids, which indeed resemble hog-troughs not a little. "Pigs, is it?" coughed Jackson, from his bunk, where he sat presiding over the banquet, but not partaking, like a devil who had lost his appetite by chewing sulphur. "Pigs, is it? And the day is close by, ye spalpeens, when you'll want to be after taking a sup at our troughs." This malicious prophecy proved true. As day followed day without glimpse of shore or reef, and headwinds drove the ship back as hounds a deer, the improvidence and short-sightedness of the passengers in the steerage with regard to their outfits for the voyage began to be followed by the inevitable results. Many of them at last went aft to the mate, saying that they had nothing to eat, their provisions were expended, and they must be supplied from the ship's stores or starve. This was told to the captain, who was obliged to issue a ukase from the cabin, that every steerage passenger, whose destitution was demonstrable, should be given 1 sea biscuit and 2 potatoes a day, a sort of substitute for a muffin and a brace of poached eggs. But this scanty ration was quite insufficient to satisfy their hunger, hardly enough to satisfy the necessities of a healthy adult. The consequence was that all day long and all through the night scores of the emigrants went about the decks seeking what they might devour. They plundered the chicken coop, and disguising the fowls, cooked them at the public galley. They made inroads upon the pig-pen in the boat, and carried off a promising young shote. Him they devoured raw, not venturing to make an incognito of his carcass. They prowled about the cook's caboose till he threatened them with a ladle of scalding water. They waylaid the steward on his regular excursions from the cook to the cabin. They hung round the forecastle to rob the bread barge. They beset the sailors like beggars in the streets, craving a mouthful in the name of the church. At length, to such excesses were they driven, that the Grand Russian, Captain Riga, issued another ukase, and to this effect: "Whatsoever immigrant is found guilty of stealing, the same shall be tied into the rigging and flogged." Upon this there were secret movements in the steerage, which almost alarmed me for the safety of the ship. But nothing serious took place, after all, and they even acquiesced in, or did not resent, a singular punishment which the captain caused to be inflicted upon a culprit of their clan as a substitute for a flogging. For no doubt he thought that such rigorous discipline as that might exacerbate 500 emigrants into an insurrection. A head was fitted to one of the large deck tubs, the half of a cask, and into this head a hole was cut. Also 2 smaller holes in the bottom of the tub. The head, divided in the middle, across the diameter of the orifice, was now fitted round the culprit's neck, and he was forthwith coopered up into the tub, which rested on his shoulders, while his legs protruded through the holes in the bottom. It was a burden to carry, but the man could walk with it, and so ridiculous was his appearance, that spite of the indignity, he himself laughed with the rest at the figure he cut. "Now, Pat, my boy," said the mate, "fill that big wooden belly of yours if you can." Compassionating his situation, our old doctor used to give him alms of food, placing it upon the cask-head before him, till at last, when the time for deliverance came, Pat protested against mercy, and would fain have continued playing Diogenes in the tub for the rest of his starving voyage. Chapter 58. Though the Highlander puts into no harbor as yet, she here and there leaves many of her passengers behind. Although fast-sailing ships, blessed with prosperous breezes, have frequently made the run across the Atlantic in 18 days, yet it is not uncommon for other vessels to be 40 or 50, and even 60, 70, 80, and 90 days in making the same passage. Though in the latter cases, some signal calamity or incapacity must occasion so great a detention. It is also true that generally the passage out from America is shorter than the return, which is to be ascribed to the prevalence of westerly winds. We had been outside of Cape Clear upward of 20 days, still harassed by headwinds, though with pleasant weather upon the whole, when we were visited by a succession of rain-storms which lasted the greater part of a week. During the interval the emigrants were obligated to remain below, but this was nothing strange to some of them, who, not recovering while at sea from their first attack of seasickness, seldom or never made their appearance on deck during the entire passage. During the week now in question, fire was only once made in the public galley. This occasioned a good deal of domestic work to be done in the steerage, which otherwise would have been done in the open air. When the lulls of the rain-storms would intervene, some unusually cleanly emigrant would climb to the deck with a bucket of slops, to toss into the sea. No experience seemed sufficient to instruct some of these ignorant people in the simplest and most elemental principles of ocean life. Spite of all lectures on the subject, several would continue to shun the leeward side of the vessel with their slops. One morning, when it was blowing very fresh, a simple fellow pitched over a gallon or two of something to windward. Instantly it flew back in his face, and also in the face of the chief mate, who happened to be standing by at the time. The offender was collared and shaken on the spot, and ironically commanded never, for the future, to throw anything to windward at sea, but fine ashes and scalding hot water. During the frequent hard blows we experienced, the hatchways on the steerage were, at intervals, hermetically closed, sealing down in their noisome den those scores of human beings. It was something to be marveled at, that the shocking fate which, but a short time ago, overtook the poor passengers in a Liverpool steamer in the Channel during similar stormy weather, and under similar treatment did not overtake some of the emigrants of the Highlander. Nevertheless, it was beyond question, this noisome confinement in so close, unventilated, and crowded a den, joined to the deprivation of sufficient food from which many were suffering, which, helped by their personal uncleanliness, brought on a malignant fever. The first report was that 2 persons were affected. No sooner was it known than the mate promptly repaired to the medicine chest in the cabin, and, with the remedies deemed suitable, descended into the steerage. But the medicines proved of no avail. The invalids rapidly grew worse, and 2 more of the emigrants became infected. Upon this, the captain himself went to see them, and, returning, sought out a certain alleged physician among the cabin passengers, begging him to wait upon the sufferers, hinting that thereby he might prevent the disease from extending into the cabin itself. But this person denied being a physician, and from fear of contagion, though he did not confess that to be the motive, refused even to enter the steerage. The cases increased, the utmost alarm spread through the ship, and scenes ensued over which, for the most part, a veil must be drawn, for such is the fastidiousness of some readers that many times they must lose the most striking incidents in a narrative like mine. Many of the panic-stricken emigrants would fain now have domiciled on deck. But being so scantily clothed, the wretched weather, wet, cold, and tempestuous, drove the best part of them again below. Yet any other human beings, perhaps, would rather have faced the most outrageous storm than continued to breathe the pestilent air of the steerage. But some of these poor people must have been so used to the most abasing calamities, that the atmosphere of a lazar house almost seemed their natural air. The first 4 cases happened to be in adjoining bunks, and the emigrants who slept in the farther part of the steerage threw up a barricade in front of those bunks so as to cut off communication. But this was no sooner reported to the captain than he ordered it to be thrown down, since it could be of no possible benefit, but would only make still worse what was already direful enough. It was not till after a good deal of mingled threatening and coaxing that the mate succeeded in getting the sailors below to accomplish the captain's order. The sight that greeted us upon entering was wretched indeed. It was like entering a crowded jail. From the rows of rude bunks, hundreds of meager, begrimed faces were turned upon us, while seated upon the chests were scores of unshaven men, smoking tea leaves and creating a suffocating vapor. But this vapor was better than the native air of the place, which from almost unbelievable causes was fetid in the extreme. In every corner the females were huddled together, weeping and lamenting. Children were asking bread from their mothers, who had none to give, and old men, seated upon the floor, were leaning back against the heads of the water casks, with closed eyes and fetching their breath with a gasp. At one end of the place was seen the barricade hiding the invalids, while, notwithstanding the crowd, in front of it was a clear area which the fear of contagion had left open. "That bulkhead must come down," cried the mate, in a voice that rose above the din. "Take hold of it, boys." But hardly had we touched the chests composing it, when a crowd of pale-faced, infuriated men rushed up, and, with terrific howls, swore they would slay us if we did not desist. "Haul it down," roared the mate. But the sailors fell back, murmuring something about merchant seamen having no pensions in case of being maimed, and they had not shipped to fight 50 to 1. Further efforts were made by the mate, who at last had recourse to entreaty, but it would not do, and we were obliged to depart without achieving our object. About 4 o'clock that morning the first 4 died. They were all men, and the scenes which ensued were frantic in the extreme. Certainly the bottomless profound of the sea over which we were sailing concealed nothing more frightful. Orders were at once passed to bury the dead, but this was unnecessary. By their own countrymen they were torn from the clasp of their wives, rolled in their own bedding with ballast stones, and with hurried rites were dropped into the ocean. At this time 10 more men had caught the disease, and with a degree of devotion worthy all praise, the mate attended them with his medicines, but the captain did not again go down to them. It was all important now that the steerage should be purified, and had it not been for the rains and squalls, which would have made it madness to turn such a number of women and children upon the wet and unsheltered decks, the steerage passengers would have been ordered above, and their den have been given a thorough cleansing. But for the present this was out of the question. The sailors peremptorily refused to go among the defilements to remove them, and so besotted were the greater part of the emigrants themselves, that though the necessity of the case was forcibly painted to them, they would not lift a hand to assist in what seemed their own salvation. The panic in the cabin was now very great, and for fear of contagion to themselves, the cabin passengers would fain have made a prisoner of the captain to prevent him from going forward beyond the mainmast. Their clamors at last induced him to tell the 2 mates that for the present they must sleep and take their meals elsewhere than in their old quarters, which communicated with the cabin. On land a pestilence is fearful enough, but there many can flee from an infected city; whereas in a ship you are locked and bolted in the very hospital itself. Nor is there any possibility of escape from it, and in so small and crowded a place no precaution can effectually guard against contagion. Horrible as the sights of the steerage now were, the cabin perhaps presented a scene equally despairing. Many who had seldom prayed before now implored the merciful heavens night and day for fair winds and fine weather. Trunks were opened for Bibles, and at last even prayer meetings were held over the very table across which the loud jest had been so often heard. Strange, though almost universal, that the seemingly nearer prospect of that death which anybody at any time may die should produce these spasmodic devotions, when an everlasting Asiatic cholera is forever thinning our ranks, and die by death we all must at last. On the second day 7 died, one of whom was the little tailor. On the third 4. On the fourth 6, of whom one was the Greenland sailor, and another a woman in the cabin, whose death, however, was afterward supposed to have been purely induced by her fears. These last deaths brought the panic to its height, and sailors, officers, cabin passengers, and emigrants all looked upon each other like lepers. All but the only true leper among us, the mariner Jackson, who seemed elated with the thought that for him, already in the deadly clutches of another disease, no danger was to be apprehended from a fever which only swept off the comparatively healthy. Thus, in the midst of the despair of the healthful, this incurable invalid was not cast down, not at least by the same considerations that appalled the rest. And still, beneath a gray, gloomy sky, the doomed craft beat on, now on this tack, now on that, battling against hostile blasts, and drenched in rain and spray, scarcely making an inch of progress toward her port. On the 6th morning the weather merged into a gale, to which we stripped our ship to a storm-stay sail. In 10 hours' time the waves ran in mountains, and the Highlander rose and fell like some vast buoy on the water. Shrieks and lamentations were driven to leeward and drowned in the roar of the wind among the cordage, while we gave to the gale the blackened bodies of 5 more of the dead. But as the dying departed, the places of 2 of them were filled in the rolls of humanity by the birth of 2 infants, whom the plague, panic, and gale had hurried into the world before their time. The first cry of one of these infants was almost simultaneous with the splash of its father's body in the sea. Thus we come and we go. But surrounded by death, both mothers and babes survived. At midnight the wind went down, leaving a long rolling sea, and for the first time in a week a clear starry sky. In the first morning watch I sat with Harry on the windlass, watching the billows, which, seen in the night, seemed real hills upon which fortresses might have been built, and real valleys in which villages and groves and gardens might have nestled. It was like a landscape in Switzerland, for down into those dark purple glens often tumbled the white foam of the wave crests like avalanches, while the seething and boiling that ensued seemed the swallowing up of human beings. By the afternoon of the next day this heavy sea subsided, and we bore down on the waves with all our canvas set, stunsails alow and aloft, and our best steersman at the helm, the captain himself at his elbow, bowling along with a fair, cheering breeze over the taffrail. The decks were cleared and swabbed bone dry, and then all the emigrants who were not invalids poured themselves out on deck, snuffing the delightful air, spreading their damp bedding in the sun, and regaling themselves with the generous charity of the captain, who of late had seen fit to increase their allowance of food. A detachment of them now joined a band of the crew, who, proceeding into the steerage, with buckets and brooms, gave it a thorough cleansing, sending on deck I know not how many buckets full of defilements. It was more like cleaning out a stable than a retreat for men and women. This day we buried 3, the next day 1, and then the pestilence left us with 7 convalescent, who, placed near the opening of the hatchway, soon rallied under the skillful treatment and even tender care of the mate. But even under this favorable turn of affairs, much apprehension was still entertained, lest, in crossing the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, the fogs, so generally encountered there, might bring on a return of the fever. But, to the joy of all hands, our fair wind still held on, and we made a rapid run across these dreaded shoals, and southward steered for New York. Our days were now fair and mild, and though the wind abated, yet we still ran our course over a pleasant sea. The steerage passengers, at least by far the greater number, wore a still, subdued aspect, though a little cheered by the genial air and the hopeful thought of soon reaching their port. But those who had lost fathers, husbands, wives, or children, needed no crape to reveal to others who they were. Hard and bitter indeed was their lot, for with the poor and desolate, grief is no indulgence of mere sentiment, however sincere, but a gnawing reality that eats into their vital beings. They have no kind condolers, and bland physicians, and troops of sympathizing friends, and they must toil, though tomorrow be the burial, and their pall-bearers throw down the hammer to lift up the coffin. How, then, would these emigrants, who, 3,000 miles from home, suddenly found themselves deprived of brothers and husbands, with but a few pounds, or perhaps but a few shillings, to buy food in a strange land? As for the passengers in the cabin, who now so jocund as they, drawing nigh with their long purses and goodly portmanteaus to the promised land, without fear of fate? One and all were generous and gay. The jelly-eyed old gentleman, before spoken of, gave a shilling to the steward. The lady who had died was an elderly person, an American, returning from a visit to an only brother in London. She had no friend or relative on board, hence, as there is little mourning for a stranger dying among strangers, her memory had been buried with her body. But the thing most worthy of note among these now light-hearted people in feathers was the gay way in which some of them bantered others upon the panic into which nearly all had been thrown. And since, if the extremest fear of a crowd in a panic of peril proves grounded on causes sufficient, they must then indeed come to perish. Therefore it is that at such times they must make up their minds either to die, or else survive to be taunted by their fellow-men with their fear. For except in extraordinary instances of exposure, there are few living men who, at bottom, are not very slow to admit that any other living men have ever been very much nearer death than themselves. Accordingly, craven is the phrase too often applied to any one who, with however good reason, has been appalled at the prospect of sudden death, and yet lived to escape it. Though, should he have perished in conformity with his fears, not a syllable of craven would you hear. This is the language of one who more than once has beheld the scenes whence these principles have been deduced. The subject invites much subtle speculation, for in every being's ideas of death, and his behavior when it suddenly menaces him, lies the best index to his life and his faith. Though the Christian era had not then begun, Socrates died the death of the Christian; and though Hume was not a Christian in theory, yet he too died the death of the Christian, humble, composed, without bravado; and though the most skeptical of philosophical skeptics, yet full of that firm, creedless faith that embraces the spheres. Seneca died dictating to posterity, Petronius lightly discoursing of essences and love songs, and Addison calling upon Christendom to behold how calmly a Christian could die. But not even the last of these three, perhaps, died the best death of the Christian. The cabin passenger, who had used to read prayers while the rest kneeled against the transoms and settees, was one of the merry young sparks who had occasioned such agonies of jealousy to the poor tailor, now no more. In his rakish vest and dangling watch-chain, this same youth, with all the awfulness of fear, had led the earnest petitions of his companions, supplicating mercy where before he had never solicited the slightest favor. More than once he had been seen thus engaged by the observant steersman at the helm, who looked through the little glass in the cabin bulkhead. But this youth was an April man. The storm had departed, and now he shone in the sun, none braver than he. One of his jovial companions ironically advised him to enter into holy orders upon his arrival in New York. "Why so?" said the other. "Have I such an orotund voice?" "No," profanely returned his friend, "but you are a coward, just the man to be a parson, and pray." However this narrative of the circumstances attending the fever among the emigrants on the Highlander may appear, and though these things happened so long ago, yet just such events, nevertheless, are perhaps taking place today. But the only account you obtain of such events is generally contained in a newspaper paragraph under the shipping head. There is the obituary of the destitute dead who die on the sea. They die like the billows that break on the shore, and no more are heard or seen. But in the events thus merely initialized in the catalogue of passing occurrences, and but glanced at by the readers of news, who are more taken up with paragraphs of fuller flavor, what a world of me and death, what a world of humanity and its woes, lies shrunk into a three-worded sentence. You see no plague ship driving through a stormy sea. You hear no groans of despair. You see no corpses thrown over the bulwarks. You mark not the wringing hands and torn hair of widows and orphans. All is a blank. And one of these blanks I have but filled up in recounting the details of the Highlander's calamity. Besides that natural tendency which hurries into oblivion the last woes of the poor, other causes combine to suppress the detailed circumstances of disasters like these. Such things, if widely known, operate unfavorably to the ship, and make her a bad name. And, to avoid detention at quarantine, a captain will state the case in the most palliating light, and strive to hush it up as much as he can. In no better place than this, perhaps, can a few words be said concerning emigrant ships in general. Let us waive that agitated national topic as to whether such multitudes of foreign poor should be landed on our American shores. Let us waive it with the one only thought, that if they can get here, they have God's right to come, though they bring all Ireland and her miseries with them. For the whole world is the patrimony of the whole world. There is no telling who does not own a stone in the Great Wall of China. But we waive all this, and will only consider how best the emigrants can come hither, since come they do, and come they must and will. Of late, a law has been passed in Congress restricting ships to a certain number of emigrants according to a certain rate. If this law were enforced, much good might be done, and so also might much good be done were the English law likewise enforced concerning the fixed supply of food for every emigrant embarking from Liverpool. But it is hardly to be believed that either of these laws is observed. But in all respects, no legislation even nominally reaches the hard lot of the emigrant. What ordinance makes it obligatory upon the captain of a ship to supply the steerage passengers with decent lodgings, and give them light and air in that foul den, where they are immured during a long voyage across the Atlantic? What ordinance necessitates him to place the galley or steerage passenger's stove in a dry place of shelter, where the emigrants can do their cooking during a storm, or wet weather? What ordinance obliges him to give them more room on deck, and let them have an occasional run fore and aft? There is no law concerning these things, and if there was, who but some Howard in office would see it enforced? And how seldom is there a Howard in office? We talk of the Turks, and abhor the cannibals, but may not some of them go to heaven before some of us? We may have civilized bodies and yet barbarous souls. We are blind to the real sights of this world, deaf to its voice, and dead to its death. And not till we know that one grief outweighs 10,000 joys will we become what Christianity is striving to make us. Chapter 59. The Last End of Jackson. "Off Cape Cod," said the steward, coming forward from the quarter-deck, where the captain had just been taking his noon observation, sweeping the vast horizon with his quadrant, like a dandy, circumnavigating the dress circle of an amphitheatre with his glass. Off Cape Cod! And in the shore bloom that came to us, even from that desert of sand-hillocks, methought I could almost distinguish the fragrance of the rose-bush my sisters and I had planted in our far inland garden at home. Delicious odors are those of our Mother Earth, which, like a flower-pot set with 1,000 shrubs, greets the eager voyager from afar. The breeze was stiff, and so drove us along that we turned over 2 broad blue furrows from our bows, as we plowed the watery prairie. By night it was a reef topsail breeze, but so impatient was the captain to make his port before a shift of wind overtook us, that even yet we carried a main top-gallant sail, though the light mast sprung like a switch. In the second dog-watch, however, the breeze became such that at last the order was given to douse the top-gallant sail, and clap a reef into all 3 topsails. While the men were settling away the halyards on deck, and before they had begun to haul out the reef tackles, to the surprise of several, Jackson came up from the forecastle, and for the first time in 4 weeks or more, took hold of a rope. Like most seamen who during the greater part of a voyage have been off duty from sickness, he was, perhaps, desirous, just previous to entering port, of reminding the captain of his existence, and also that he expected his wages. But alas, his wages proved the wages of sin. At no time could he better signalize his disposition to work than upon an occasion like the present, which generally attracts every soul on deck, from the captain to the child in the steerage. His aspect was damp and death-like. The blue hollows of his eyes were like vaults full of snakes, and issuing so unexpectedly from his dark tomb in the forecastle, he looked like a man raised from the dead. Before the sailors had made fast the reef tackle, Jackson was tottering up the rigging, thus getting the start of them, and securing his place at the extreme weather end of the topsail yard, which in reefing is accounted the post of honor. For it was one of the characteristics of this man, that though when on duty he would shy away from mere dull work in a calm, yet in tempest time he always claimed the van, and would yield it to none. And this, perhaps, was one cause of his unbounded dominion over the men. Soon we were all strung along the main topsail yard, the ship rearing and plunging under us like a runaway steed, each man gripping his reef point, and sideways leaning, dragging the sail over toward Jackson, whose business it was to confine the reef corner to the yard. His hat and shoes were off, and he rode the yard-arm end leaning backward to the gale, and pulling at the ear-ring rope, like a bridle. At all times this is a moment of frantic exertion with sailors, whose spirits seem then to partake of the commotion of the elements, as they hang in the gale, between heaven and earth. And then it is, too, that they are the most profane. "Haul out to windward," coughed Jackson, with a blasphemous cry, and he threw himself back with a violent strain upon the bridle in his hand. But the wild words were hardly out of his mouth when his hands dropped to his side, and the bellying sail was spattered with a torrent of blood from his lungs. As the man next him stretched out his arm to save, Jackson fell headlong from the yard, and with a long seethe plunged like a diver into the sea. It was when the ship had rolled to windward, which, with the long projection of the yard arm over the side, made him strike far out upon the water. His fall was seen by the whole upward-gazing crowd on deck, some of whom were spotted with the blood that trickled from the sail, while they raised a spontaneous cry so shrill and wild that a blind man might have known something deadly had happened. Clutching our reef points, we hung over the stick and gazed down to the one white bubbling spot which had closed over the head of our shipmate. But the next minute it was brewed into the common yeast of the waves, and Jackson never arose. We waited a few minutes, expecting an order to descend, haul back the fore-yard, and man the boat. But instead of that, the next sound that greeted us was, "Bear a hand, and reef away, men," from the mate. Indeed, upon reflection, it would have been idle to attempt to save Jackson, for, besides that, he must have been dead ere he struck the sea, and if he had not been dead then, the first immersion must have driven his soul from his lacerated lungs. Our jolly boat would have taken full 15 minutes to launch into the waves. And here it should be said, that the thoughtless security in which too many sea captains indulge would, in case of some sudden disaster befalling the Highlander, have let us all drop into our graves. Like most merchant ships, we had but two boats, the long boat and the jolly boat. The long boat, by far the largest and stoutest of the two, was permanently bolted down to the deck, by iron bars attached to its sides. It was almost as much of a fixture as the vessel's keel. It was filled with pigs, fowls, firewood, and coals. Over this, the jolly boat was capsized, without a thole-pin in the gunwales, its bottom bleaching and cracking in the sun. Judge, then, what promise of salvation for us had we shipwrecked. Yet in this state, one merchant ship out of 3 keeps its boats. To be sure, no vessel full of emigrants, by any possible precautions, could, in case of a fatal disaster at sea, hope to save the 10th part of the souls on board. Yet provision should certainly be made for a handful of survivors to carry home the tidings of her loss. For even in the worst of the calamities that befell patient Job, some one, at least, of his servants escaped to report it. In a way that I never could fully account for, the sailors, in my hearing at least, and Harry's, never made the slightest allusion to the departed Jackson. One and all, they seemed tacitly to unite in hushing up his memory among them. Whether it was that the severity of the bondage under which this man held every one of them did really corrode in their secret hearts, that they thought to repress the recollection of a thing so degrading, I cannot determine. But certain it was that his death was their deliverance, which they celebrated by an elevation of spirits unknown before. Doubtless, this was to be in part imputed, however, to their now drawing near to their port. End of Section 13, recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 14 of Redburn, His First Voyage. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Redburn, His First Voyage, by Herman Melville. Chapters 60 through 62. Chapter 60. Home at Last. Next day was Sunday, and the midday sun shone upon a glassy sea. After the uproar of the breeze and the gale, this profound, pervading calm seemed suited to the tranquil spirit of a day which, in godly towns, makes quiet vistas of the most tumultuous thoroughfares. The ship lay gently rolling in the soft, subdued ocean swell, while all around were faint white spots, and nearer to, broad milky patches, betokening the vicinity of scores of ships, all bound to one common port, and tranced in one common calm. Here the long, devious wakes from Europe, Africa, India, and Peru converged to a line which braided them all in one. Full before us quivered and danced, in the noonday heat and mid-air, the green heights of New Jersey, and by an optical delusion the blue sea seemed to flow under them. The sailors whistled and whistled for a wind. The impatient cabin passengers were arrayed in their best, and the emigrants clustered around the bows with eyes intent upon the long-sought land. But leaning over in a reverie against the side, my Carlo gazed down into the calm, violet sea, as if it were an eye that answered his own, and turning to Harry, said, "This America's skies must be down in the sea, for looking down in this water I behold what, in Italy, we also behold overhead. Ah, after all, I find my Italy somewhere, wherever I go. I even found it in rainy Liverpool." Presently up came a dainty breeze, wafting to us a white wing from the shore, the pilot-boat. Soon a monkey-jacket mounted the side, and was beset by the captain and cabin people for news, and out of bottomless pockets came bundles of newspapers, which were eagerly caught by the throng. The captain now abdicated in the pilot's favor, who proved to be a tiger of a fellow, keeping us hard at work, pulling and hauling the braces, and trimming the ship to catch the least cat's paw of wind. When, among sea-worn people, a strange man from shore suddenly stands among them, with the smell of the land in his beard, it conveys a realization of the vicinity of the green grass, that not even the distant sight of the shore itself can transcend. The steerage was now as a bedlam. Trunks and chests were locked and tied round with ropes, and a general washing and rinsing of faces and hands was beheld. While this was going on, forth came an order from the quarter-deck for every bed, blanket, bolster, and bundle of straw in the steerage to be committed to the deep, a command that was received by the emigrants with dismay, and then with wrath. But they were assured that this was indispensable to the getting rid of an otherwise long detention of some weeks at the quarantine. They therefore reluctantly complied, and overboard went pallet and pillow. Following them went old pots and pans, bottles and baskets. So, all around, the sea was strewn with stuffed bed-ticks that limberly floated on the waves, couches for all mermaids who were not fastidious. Numberless things of this sort, tossed overboard from emigrant ships nearing the harbor of New York, drift in through the Narrows, and are deposited on the shores of Staten Island, along whose eastern beach I have often walked, and speculated upon the broken jugs, torn pillows, and dilapidated baskets at my feet. A second order was now passed for the emigrants to muster their forces, and give the steerage a final, thorough cleaning with sand and water. And to this they were incited by the same warning which had induced them to make an offering to Neptune of their bedding. The place was then fumigated and dried with pans of coals from the galley, so that by evening no stranger would have imagined from her appearance that the Highlander had made otherwise than a tidy and prosperous voyage. Thus some sea captains take good heed that benevolent citizens shall not get a glimpse of the true condition of the steerage while at sea. That night it again fell calm, but next morning, though the wind was somewhat against us, we set sail for the Narrows, and, making short tacks, at last ran through, almost bringing our jib boom over one of the forts. An earlier shower had refreshed the woods and fields, that glowed with a glorious green, and to our salted lungs the land breeze was spiced with aromas. The steerage passengers almost neighed with delight, like horses brought back to spring pastures, and every eye and ear in the Highlander was full of the glad sights and sounds of the shore. No more did we think of the gale and the plague, nor turn our eyes upward to the stains of blood still visible on the topsail, whence Jackson had fallen. But we fixed our gaze on the orchards and meads, and, like thirsty men, drank in all their due. On the Staten Island side, a white staff displayed a pale yellow flag, denoting the habitation of the quarantine officer. For, as if to symbolize the yellow fever itself, and strike a panic and premonition of the black vomit into every beholder, all quarantines all over the world taint the air with the streamings of their fever flag. But though the long rows of whitewashed hospitals on the hillside were now in plain sight, and though scores of ships were here lying at anchor, yet no boat came off to us, and to our surprise and delight, on we sailed, past a spot which every one had dreaded. How it was that they thus let us pass without boarding us, we never could learn. Now rose the city from out the bay, and one by one her spires pierced the blue, while thick and more thick, ships, brigs, schooners, and sailboats thronged around. We saw the Hart's forest of masts and black rigging stretching along the East River, and northward, up the stately old Hudson, covered with white sloop sails like fleets of swans, we caught a far glimpse of the purple Palisades. Oh, he who has never been afar, let him once go from home, to know what home is. For as you draw nigh again to your old native river, he seems to pour through you with all his tides, and in your enthusiasm you swear to build altars like milestones along both his sacred banks. Like the Czar of all the Russias, and Siberia to boot, Captain Riga, telescope in hand, stood on the poop, pointing out to the passengers Governor's Island, Castle Garden, and the Battery. And that, said he, pointing out a vast black hull, which, like a shark, showed tiers of teeth, that, ladies, is a line of battle-ship, the North Carolina. Oh dear, and oh my, ejaculated the ladies, and Lord save us, responded an old gentleman who was a member of the Peace Society. Hurrah, hurrah, and 10,000 times hurrah! Down goes our old anchor, fathoms down into the free and independent Yankee mud, one handful of which was now worth a broad manor in England. The Whitehall boats were around us, and soon our cabin passengers were all off, gay as crickets, and bound for a late dinner at the Astor House, where no doubt they fired off a salute of champagne corks in honor of their own arrival. Only a very few of the steerage passengers, however, could afford to pay the high price the watermen demanded for carrying them ashore, so most of them remained with us till morning. But nothing could restrain our Italian boy Carlo, who, promising the watermen to pay them with his music, was triumphantly rowed ashore, seated in the stern of the boat, his organ before him, and something like Hail Columbia his tune. We gave him 3 rapturous cheers, and we never saw Carlo again. Harry and I passed the greater part of the night walking the deck and gazing at the 1,000 lights of the city. At sunrise we warped into a berth at the foot of Wall Street, and knotted our old ship, stem and stern, to the pier. But that knotting of her was the unknotting of the bonds of the sailors, among whom it is a maxim that the ship once fast to the wharf, they are free. So, with a rush and a shout, they bounded ashore, followed by the tumultuous crowd of emigrants, whose friends, day laborers, and housemaids stood ready to embrace them. But in silent gratitude at the end of a voyage, almost equally uncongenial to both of us, and so bitter to one, Harry and I sat on a chest in the forecastle. And now the ship that we had loathed grew lovely in our eyes, which lingered over every familiar old timber. For the scene of suffering is a scene of joy when the suffering is past, and the silent reminiscence of hardships departed is sweeter than the presence of delight. Chapter 61. Redburn and Harry, arm in arm, in harbor. There we sat in that tarry old den, the only inhabitants of the deserted old ship but the mate and the rats. At last, Harry went to his chest, and drawing out a few shillings, proposed that we should go ashore and return with a supper to eat in the forecastle. Little else that was eatable being for sale in the paltry shops along the wharves, we bought several pies, some doughnuts, and a bottle of ginger pop, and thus supplied we made merry. For to us, whose very mouths were become pickled and puckered with the continual flavor of briny beef, those pies and doughnuts were most delicious. And as for the ginger pop, why, that ginger pop was divine. I have reverenced ginger pop ever since. We kept late hours that night, for delightful certainty placed beyond all doubt, like royal landsmen, we were masters of the watches of the night, and no starbolines ahoy would annoy us again. All night in. Think of that, Harry, my friend. Ay, Wellingborough, it's enough to keep me awake forever, to think I may now sleep as long as I please. We turned out bright and early, and then prepared for the shore, first stripping to the waist for a toilet. I shall never get these confounded tar stains out of my fingers, cried Harry, rubbing them hard with a bit of oakum, steeped in strong suds. No, they will not come out, and I'm ruined for life. Look at my hand once, Wellingborough. It was indeed a sad sight. Every fingernail, like mine, was dyed of a rich russet hue, looking something like bits of fine tortoise-shell. Never mind, Harry, said I. You know, the ladies of the East steep the tips of their fingers in some golden dye. And by Plutus, cried Harry, I'd steep mine up to the armpits in gold, since you talk about that. But never mind, I'll swear I'm just from Persia, my boy. We now arrayed ourselves in our best, and sallied ashore, and at once I piloted Harry to the sign of a turkey-cock in Fulton Street, kept by one Sweeney, a place famous for cheap souchong and capital buckwheat cakes. "Well, gentlemen, what will you have?" said a waiter, as we seated ourselves at a table. "Gentlemen," whispered Harry to me. "Gentlemen, hear him. I say now, Redburn, they didn't talk to us that way on board the old Highlander. By heaven, I begin to feel my straps again. Coffee and hot rolls," he added aloud, crossing his legs like a lord. "And, fellow, come back. Bring us a venison steak." "Haven't got it, gentlemen." "Ham and eggs," suggested I, whose mouth was watering at the recollection of that particular dish, which I had tasted at the sign of the turkey-cock before. So ham and eggs it was, and royal coffee, and imperial toast. But the butter. "Harry, did you ever taste such butter as this before?" "Don't say a word," said Harry, spreading his 10th slice of toast. "I'm going to turn dairyman, and keep within the blessed savor of butter so long as I live." We made a breakfast never to be forgotten, paid our bill with a flourish, and sallied into the street like two goodly galleons of gold, bound from Acapulco to old Spain. "Now," said Harry, "lead on, and let's see something of these United States of yours. I'm ready to pace from Maine to Florida, ford the Great Lakes, and jump the river Ohio, if it comes in the way. Here, take my arm, lead on." Such was the miraculous change that had now come over him. It reminded me of his manner when we had started for London from the Sign of the Golden Anchor in Liverpool. He was, indeed, in most wonderful spirits, at which I could not help marveling, considering the cavity in his pockets, and that he was a stranger in the land. By noon he had selected his boarding-house, a private establishment where they did not charge much for their board, and where the landlady's butcher's bill was not very large. Here, at last, I left him to get his chest from the ship, while I turned up town to see my old friend Mr. Jones, and learn what had happened during my absence. With one hand Mr. Jones shook mine most cordially, and with the other gave me some letters which I eagerly devoured. Their purport compelled my departure homeward, and I at once sought out Harry to inform him. Strange, but even the few hours' absence which had intervened, during which Harry had been left to himself to stare at strange streets and strange faces, had wrought a marked change in his countenance. He was a creature of the suddenest impulses. Left to himself, the strange streets seemed now to have reminded him of his friendless condition, and I found him with a very sad eye, and his right hand groping in his pocket. "Where am I going to dine this day week?" he slowly said. "What's to be done, Wellingborough?" And when I told him that the next afternoon I must leave him, he looked downhearted enough; but I cheered him as well as I could, though needing a little cheering myself, even though I had got home again. But no more about that. Now there was a young man of my acquaintance in the city, much my senior, by the name of Goodwell, and a good-natured fellow he was, who had of late been engaged as a clerk in a large forwarding house in South Street, and it occurred to me that he was just the man to befriend Harry, and procure him a place. So I mentioned the thing to my comrade, and we called upon Goodwell. I saw that he was impressed by the handsome exterior of my friend, and in private, making known the case, he faithfully promised to do his best for him, though the times, he said, were quite dull. That evening, Goodwell, Harry, and I perambulated the streets, three abreast. Goodwell spending his money freely at the oyster saloons, Harry full of allusions to the London club-houses, and myself contributing a small quota to the general entertainment. Next morning we proceeded to business. Now I did not expect to draw much of a salary from the ship, so as to retire for life on the profits of my first voyage; but nevertheless I thought that $1 or 2 might be coming, for dollars are valuable things, and should not be overlooked when they are owing. Therefore, as the second morning after our arrival had been set apart for paying off the crew, Harry and I made our appearance on shipboard with the rest. We were told to enter the cabin, and once again I found myself, after an interval of 4 months and more, surrounded by its mahogany and maple. Seated in a sumptuous arm-chair behind a lustrous inlaid desk, sat Captain Riga, arrayed in his City Hotel suit, looking magisterial as the Lord High Admiral of England. Hat in hand, the sailors stood deferentially in a semicircle before him, while the captain held the ship papers in his hand, and one by one called their names, and in mellow bank notes, beautiful sight, paid them their wages. Most of them had less than 10, a few 20, and 2 $30 coming to them, while the old cook, whose piety proved profitable in restraining him from the expensive excesses of most seafaring men, and who had taken no pay in advance, had the goodly round sum of $70 as his due. 7 $10 bills, each of which, as I calculated at the time, was worth precisely 100 dimes, which were equal to 1,000 cents, which were again subdivisible into fractions. So that he now stepped into a fortune of 70,000 American mitts. Only $70 after all, but then it has always seemed to me that stating amounts in sounding fractional sums conveys a much fuller notion of their magnitude than by disguising their immensity in such aggregations of value as doubloons, sovereigns, and dollars. Who would not rather be worth 125,000 francs in Paris than only 5,000 pounds in London, though the intrinsic value of the two sums in round numbers is pretty much the same? With a scrape of the foot, and such a bow as only a negro can make, the old cook marched off with his fortune, and I have no doubt at once invested it in a grand underground oyster cellar. The other sailors, after counting their cash very carefully, and seeing all was right, and not a bank note was dog-eared, in which case they would have demanded another, for they are not to be taken in and cheated, your sailors, and they know their rights too, at least when they are at liberty after the voyage is concluded. The sailors also salaamed and withdrew, leaving Harry and me face to face with the Paymaster General of the forces. We stood awhile, looking as polite as possible, and expecting every moment to hear our names called, but not a word did we hear, while the captain, throwing aside his accounts, lighted a very fragrant cigar, took up the morning paper, I think it was the Herald, threw his leg over one arm of the chair, and plunged into the latest intelligence from all parts of the world. I looked at Harry, and he looked at me, and then we both looked at this incomprehensible captain. At last Harry hemmed, and I scraped my foot to increase the disturbance. The Paymaster General looked up. "Well, where do you come from? Who are you, pray, and what do you want? Steward, show these young gentlemen out." "I want my money," said Harry. "My wages are due," said I. The captain laughed. Oh, he was exceedingly merry, and taking a long inspiration of smoke, removed his cigar, and sat sideways looking at us, letting the vapor slowly wriggle and spiralize out of his mouth. "Upon my soul, young gentlemen, you astonish me. Are your names down in the city directory? Have you any letters of introduction, young gentlemen?" "Captain Riga," cried Harry, enraged at his impudence, "I tell you what it is, Captain Riga, this won't do. Where's the rhino?" "Captain Riga," added I, "do you not remember that about 4 months ago my friend Mr. Jones and myself had an interview with you in this very cabin, when it was agreed that I was to go out in your ship and receive $3 per month for my services? Well, Captain Riga, I have gone out with you, and returned, and now, sir, I'll thank you for my pay." "Ah, yes, I remember," said the captain. "Mr. Jones, ha, ha, I remember Mr. Jones, a very gentlemanly gentleman. And stop. You, too, are the son of a wealthy French importer. And let me think, was not your great-uncle a barber?" "No," I thundered. "Well, well, young gentleman, really I beg your pardon. Steward, chairs for the young gentlemen. Be seated, young gentlemen. And now let me see," turning over his accounts. Yes, here it is. Wellingborough, Redburn, at $3 a month. Say 4 months, that's $12, less $3 advanced in Liverpool, that makes it $9, less 3 hammers and 2 scrapers lost overboard, that brings it to $4.25. I owe you $4.25, I believe, young gentlemen." "So it seems, sir," said I, with staring eyes. "And now let me see what you owe me, and then we'll be able to square the yards, Monsieur Redburn. Oh, him, thought I. What do I owe him but a grudge? But I concealed my resentment, and presently he said, "By running away from the ship in Liverpool, you forfeited your wages, which amount to $12, and as there has been advanced to you in money, hammers, and scrapers, $7.75, you are therefore indebted to me in precisely that sum. Now, young gentleman, I'll thank you for the money," and he extended his open palm across the desk. "Shall I pitch into him?" whispered Harry. I was thunderstruck at this most unforeseen announcement of the state of my account with Captain Riga, and I began to understand why it was that he had till now ignored my absence from the ship when Harry and I were in London. But a single minute's consideration showed that I could not help myself. So, telling him that he was at liberty to begin his suit, for I was a bankrupt and could not pay him, I turned to go. Now, here was this man actually turning a poor lad adrift without a copper, after he had been slaving aboard his ship for more than 4 mortal months. But Captain Riga was a bachelor of expensive habits, and had run up large wine bills at the City Hotel. He could not afford to be munificent. Peace to his dinners. "Mr. Bolton, I believe," said the captain, now blandly bowing toward Harry. "Mr. Bolton, you also shipped for $3 per month, and you had 1 month's advance in Liverpool, and from dock to dock we have been about a month and a half. So I owe you just $1.50, Mr. Bolton, and here it is," handing him 6 two-shilling pieces. "And this," said Harry, throwing himself into a tragical attitude, "this is the reward of my long and faithful services?" Then, disdainfully flinging the silver on the desk, he exclaimed, "There, Captain Riga, you may keep your 10. It has been in your purse, and it would give me the itch to retain it. Good morning, sir." "Good morning, young gentleman. Pray call again," said the captain, coolly bagging the coins. His politeness while in port was invincible. Quitting the cabin, I remonstrated with Harry upon his recklessness in disdaining his wages, small though they were. I begged to remind him of his situation, and hinted that every penny he could get might prove precious to him. But he only cried, "Pshaw!" and that was the last of it. Going forward, we found the sailors congregated on the forecastle deck, engaged in some earnest discussion, while several carts on the wharf, loaded with their chests, were just in the act of driving off, destined for the boarding-houses up town. By the looks of our shipmates, I saw very plainly that they must have some mischief under way, and so it turned out. Now, though Captain Riga had not been guilty of any particular outrage against the sailors, yet by 1,000 small meannesses, such as indirectly causing their allowance of bread and beef to be diminished, without betraying any appearance of having any inclination that way, and without speaking to the sailors on the subject, by this and kindred actions, I say, he had contracted the cordial dislike of the whole ship's company, and long since they had bestowed upon him a name unmentionably expressive of their contempt. The voyage was now concluded, and it appeared that the subject being debated by the assembly on the forecastle was, how best they might give a united and valedictory expression of the sentiments they entertained toward their late lord and master. Some emphatic symbol of those sentiments was desired, some unmistakable token which should forcibly impress Captain Riga with the justest possible notion of their feelings. It was like a meeting of the members of some mercantile company, upon the eve of a prosperous dissolution of the concern, when the subordinates, actuated by the purest gratitude toward their president or chief, proceed to vote him a silver pitcher in token of their respect. It was something like this, I repeat, but with a material difference, as will be seen. At last, the precise manner in which the thing should be done being agreed upon, Blunt, the Irish Cockney, was deputed to summon the captain. He knocked at the cabin door, and politely requested the steward to inform Captain Riga that some gentlemen were on the pier-head earnestly seeking him, whereupon he joined his comrades. In a few moments the captain sallied from the cabin, and found the gentleman alluded to strung along the top of the bulwarks on the side next to the wharf. Upon his appearance, the row suddenly wheeled about, presenting their backs, and making a motion which was a polite salute to everything before them, but an abominable insult to all who happened to be in their rear, they gave 3 cheers, and at one bound cleared the ship. True to his imperturbable politeness while in port, Captain Riga only lifted his hat, smiled very blandly, and slowly returned into his cabin. Wishing to see the last movements of this remarkable crew, who were so clever ashore and so craven afloat, Harry and I followed them along the wharf till they stopped at a sailor retreat, poetically denominated the Flashes, and here they all came to anchor before the bar, and the landlord, a lantern-jawed landlord, bestirred himself behind it among his villainous old bottles and decanters. He well knew from their looks that his customers were flush, and would spend their money freely, as indeed is the case with most seamen recently paid off. It was a touching scene. "Well, mateys," said one of them, at last, "I s'pose we shan't see each other again. Come, let's splice the main brace all round, and drink to the last voyage." Upon this, the landlord danced down his glasses on the bar, uncorked his decanters, and deferentially pushed them over toward the sailors, as much as to say, "Honorable gentlemen, it is not for me to allowance your liquor. Help yourselves, your honors." And so they did, each glass a bumper, and standing in a row tossed them all off, shook hands all round, 3 times 3, and then disappeared in couples through the several doorways, for the Flashes was on a corner. If to every one life be made up of farewells and greetings, and a good-bye, God bless you, is heard for every how do you do, welcome, a boy, then of all men, sailors shake the most hands and wave the most hats. They are here, and then they are there, ever shifting themselves, they shift among the shifting, and like rootless seaweed are tossed to and fro. As, after shaking our hands, our shipmates departed, Harry and I stood on the corner awhile, till we saw the last man disappear. "They are gone," said I. "Thank heaven," said Harry. Chapter 62. The last that was ever heard of Harry Bolton. That same afternoon I took my comrade down to the battery, and we sat on one of the benches under the summer shade of the trees. It was a quiet, beautiful scene, full of promenading ladies and gentlemen, and through the foliage, so fresh and bright, we looked out over the bay, varied with glancing ships, and then we looked down to our boots, and thought what a fine world it would be if we only had a little money to enjoy it. But that's the everlasting rub. Oh, who can cure an empty pocket? "I have no doubt Goodwell will take care of you, Harry," said I. "He's a fine, good-hearted fellow, and will do his best for you, I know." "No doubt of it," said Harry, looking hopeless. "And I need not tell you, Harry, how sorry I am to leave you so soon." "And I am sorry enough myself," said Harry, looking very sincere. "But I will be soon back again, I doubt not," said I. "Perhaps so," said Harry, shaking his head. "How far is it off?" "Only 180 miles," said I. 180 miles," said Harry, drawing the words out like an endless ribbon. "Why, I couldn't walk that in a month." "Now, my dear friend," said I, "take my advice, and while I am gone, keep up a stout heart, never despair, and all will be well." But notwithstanding all I could say to encourage him, Harry felt so bad that nothing would do but a rush to a neighboring bar, where we both gulped down a glass of ginger pop, after which we felt better. He accompanied me to the steamboat that was to carry me homeward. He stuck close to my side till she was about to put off, then, standing on the wharf, he shook me by the hand, till we almost counteracted the play of the paddles. And at last, with a mutual jerk at the armpits, we parted. I never saw Harry again. I pass over the reception I met with at home. How I plunged into embraces long and loving. I pass over this, and will conclude my first voyage by relating all I know of what overtook Harry Bolton. Circumstances beyond my control detained me at home for several weeks, during which I wrote to my friend without receiving an answer. I then wrote to young Goodwell, who returned me the following letter, now spread before me. Dear Redburn, Your poor friend Harry I cannot find anywhere. After you left, he called upon me several times, and we walked out together, and my interest in him increased every day. But you don't know how dull are the times here, and what multitudes of young men, well qualified, are seeking employment in counting-houses. I did my best, but could not get Harry a place. However, I cheered him, but he grew more and more melancholy, and at last told me that he had sold all his clothes but those on his back to pay his board. I offered to loan him a few dollars, but he would not receive them. I called upon him 2 or 3 times after this, but he was not in. At last his landlady told me that he had permanently left her house the very day before. Upon my questioning her closely as to where he had gone, she answered that she did not know, but from certain hints that had dropped from our poor friend, she feared he had gone on a whaling voyage. I at once went to the offices in South Street, where men are shipped for the Nantucket whalers, and made inquiries among them, but without success. And this, I am heartily grieved to say, is all I know of our friend. I cannot believe that his melancholy could bring him to the insanity of throwing himself away in a whaler, and I still think that he must be somewhere in the city. You must come down yourself and help me seek him out. This letter gave me a dreadful shock. Remembering our adventure in London and his conduct there, remembering how liable he was to yield to the most sudden, crazy, and contrary impulses, and that as a friendless, penniless foreigner in New York, he must have had the most terrible incitements to committing violence upon himself, I shuddered to think that even now, while I thought of him, he might no more be living. So strong was this impression at the time, that I quickly glanced over the papers to see if there were any accounts of suicides or drowned persons floating in the harbor of New York. I now made all the haste I could to the seaport, but though I sought him all over, no tidings whatever could be heard. To relieve my anxiety, Goodwell endeavored to assure me that Harry must indeed have departed on a whaling voyage. But, remembering his bitter experience on board the Highlander, and more than all, his nervousness about going aloft, it seemed next to impossible. At last I was forced to give him up. Years after this, I found myself a sailor in the Pacific, on board of a whaler. One day at sea, we spoke another whaler, and the boat's crew that boarded our vessel came forward among us to have a little sea-chat, as is always customary upon such occasions. Among the strangers was an Englishman who had shipped in his vessel at Callao for the cruise. In the course of conversation he made allusion to the fact that he had now been in the Pacific several years, and that the good craft Huntress of Nantucket had had the honor of originally bringing him round upon that side of the globe. I asked him why he had abandoned her. He answered that she was the most unlucky of ships. We had hardly been out 3 months, said he, when on the Brazil banks we lost a boat's crew chasing a whale after sundown, and next day lost a poor little fellow, a countryman of mine, who had never entered the boats. He fell over the side, and was jammed between the ship and a whale, while we were cutting the fish in. Poor fellow! He had a hard time of it from the beginning. He was a gentleman's son, and when you could coax him to it, he sang like a bird. What was his name? Said I, trembling with expectation. What kind of eyes did he have? What was the color of his hair? Harry Bolton was not your brother? Cried the stranger, starting. Harry Bolton. It was even he. But yet I, Wellingborough Redburn, chanced to survive, after having passed through far more perilous scenes than any narrated in this my first voyage, which here I end. End of section 14. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.